So students, today I'm going to start with Caroline age. So 1625 to 1649, 1625 to 1649, it is the age of Charles I. And Charles was the second son of King James I of Jacobean age. His elder brother predeceased his father in 1612, and that was the reason why Charles became the King of England. And Charles, who believed in the divine right of kings means that they are like God, and he thought that he could govern according to his own conscience, according to his own right, according to his own self system. And because of this, he interfered in the English and the Scottish churches and put or levied heavy taxes on them. His other religious policies, coupled with his marriage to Roman Catholic princess Henrietta Maria of France, generated antipathy and mistrust in the reform groups like the Puritans and the Calvinists. He even failed to successfully aid the Protestant forces during the 30 Years' War, and thus, by the end of 1648, Oliver Cromwell's new model army, who had consolidated its control over England. Charles was tried, convicted, and executed for high treason in 1649. The monarchy was abolished and a republic called the Commonwealth of England was now declared. So this is important thing which students you have to remember. The chronological development of the history of English literature, taking into consideration all the four aspects now, that is drama, poetry, fiction, and non-fiction. Now we will go ahead with the Cavalier poets. The poets in the middle of the 17th century are divided into two major groups. The first, who are known as the religious or the secular poets, those from among the royalists are known as the Cavaliers, like Robert Herrick, Thomas Carew, Sir John Suckling, and Richard Lovelace are known as Cavalier poets, or you may also call them Cavalier lyricists. The speciality or the feature of these poets is that they kept their royalism, because they belong to the royal families. They kept their royalism away from their poetic activity. They are lyrical poets who basically or chiefly dealt with love, beauty, and war. They even write songs in a very gay, trivial, and sometimes licentious tone, or the lines were sometimes licentious. And these Cavalier poets came under the influence of Ben Jonson and John Donne, and most of them felt proud in calling themselves sons of Ben. They derived from Ben Jonson the clarity, the lucidity of expression, control of emotions, and sophistication of tone. It is because of the influence of Donne that their poetry is characterized by metaphysical conceits and the tendency of introspective self analysis. And you must also know that these Cavalier poets shared a few common features in their poetry. And what are these common features? That all of them wrote lyrics, short poems, but for the sonnet tradition, they had no liking. Their poems were polished. Their poems were elegant, even though they are totally urbane. They have also shown love for the natural scenes, the natural sights, which reveal their lyrical power of a high order, along with their keen observant quality. And these poets are divided into two groups, that is, the religious poets, subdivided into Anglican and the Puritans, and the secular poets. Those poets from among the royalists are Cavaliers like Herrick, Suckling, Lovelace, Carew. These are known as Cavalier lyricists, which I have just told you. Now, I'll give you a brief introduction of these poets as well. First is Robert Herrick. His collection of poems is known as Hesperides, which is supposed to include both the human as well as the divine. And he was a parish priest who had a lot of love for the countryside. And as a parish poet or a parish priest, he loved the countryside and combines the pastoral as well as the sensual. And his poems on the countryside also include a poem known as Hawk Cart. Then we have the next John Suckling, who was totally unconcerned with moral values, extravagant, mostly interested in gambling, and his well-known verse is Ballad upon a Wedding. He had a collection of light poems with ironic touches, and neither of his contemporaries could match him in this type of poetry, whatever he used to write. The next poet is Richard Lovelace. He basically made his people, the followers of Richard Lovelace, were fascinated by his hyperbolic verses addressed to beautiful ladies and also attracted them in real life. Why? Because he was very handsome. His well-known volume of poems is known as Lucasta. Well-known poem collection is known as Lucasta. Then John Cleveland. He wrote poems on a very different note, mostly being satires, particularly the one written in defense of Charles I. And the title of this satire is The Rebel Scot. He also wrote many poems in imitation of John Donne and also used far-fetched conceits like him, like John Donne used to write. He is known as a writer of conceits and metaphors. He was also a love poet, but could not take much pain, which is evident in his volume, A Session of Poet. A Session of Poet. He is also called easy natural suckling, quote unquote, because of his characteristic feature of his poetry, and only wrote when he got the leisure time to do it. And the Cavalier poets shared a few common features in their poetry. And what are those? All of them wrote lyrics, short poems, but for the sonnet tradition, they had actually no likings. Clear? Now, we will move ahead to the Commonwealth period. oblique, and the age is 1649 to 1660. So, in continuation with the Charles I's age, and what happened when after the execution of the King Charles I, what was declared? Republic was declared, known as the Commonwealth of England. And Oliver Cromwell was declared the Lord Protector of England, Lord Protector of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland from 16th of December 1649. After his death in 1658, he was buried in Westminster Abbey. But after the Royalists returned to power in 1660, they had his corpse dug up, hung in chains, and beheaded. And who was the second Lord Protector? The first Lord Protector being Oliver Cromwell. So the second Lord Protector came in 1658 when Oliver Cromwell was beheaded, he died, and Richard Cromwell was the second ruling protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland, serving for just 9 months. And due to many and various political reasons, Cromwell eventually gave up his position on 22nd of April. Parliament was dissolved, and the dump Parliament was recalled on 7th May 1659. On 25th of May, Cromwell delivered a formal letter resigning the position of the Lord Protector. He was never formally deposed or arrested, but he was allowed to fade away. Royalists rejoiced at Cromwell's fall, and many satirical remarks like "tumble down Dick," "Queen Dick" was given to Richard Cromwell. And from here starts the Puritan age, or we can also say the Miltonic age, the age of Milton, which starts from 1625 and goes up to 1660. And this period, students, which extends from 1625 to 1600, is described as the age of Milton, which also marks the end of what is known as the Renaissance, which started in 1485. And the age of Milton is filled with a lot of political and religious strifes of the reign of Charles I and the triumph of Puritanism. And because of the Queen's death, that is Queen Elizabeth, back in 1603, the patriotic unity, the brotherhood, the oneness could not survive. And James I, who could not reign long before the country found itself amidst a lot of conflict, which had been foreshadowed in the Elizabeth's time. And this long struggle between the king and the parliament grew bitter and bitter till it reached its climax with the execution of Charles I in 1649. And this growth of Puritanism had important consequences on the literary life of the nation. They were hostile to the theaters, and thereby you must have seen that it was actually a complete closure of the dramatic performances in 1642, which was the final blow to the declining Elizabethan drama. And this is also true that Milton was the greatest product of the Puritanism in English literature. And in his work, we find lot of moral and religious influences of Puritanism combining with culture of the Renaissance. Cromwell's government was highly efficient, but after all, it was a military dictatorship. And slow, after a certain period of time, people began to feel uncomfortable. And after experiencing the discomforts of an unstable government, there was a general welcome to the exiled Charles II, who was exiled in France, and whose return to England marked the restoration of monarchy again in 1660 after a gap of 11-12 years. Because Milton was the main poet of this age, so we will also find here Milton's poetic development. Milton was actually a great scholar, but a lonely scholar who was more skilled in Latin compared to English. And his first great English poem was On the Morning of Christ's Nativity, which he wrote on his 21st birthday. Then there are two companion poems known as El Allegro and Il Penseroso. Il Allegro. These two are companion poems, neoclassical poems, in which Milton uses the octosyllabic couplet. If we talk about El Allegro, the verse moves forward with a swing of joyous note. And in Il Penseroso, the matter is employed with a lot of skill and dexterity. Then he has written a mask known as Comus. In this mask, Comus, Milton's style assumes a change in tone and form. It is written in blank verse, which is grand, stately, and splendid. And here, the gorgeous imagery and the style becomes, in the words of Dr. Johnson, inelegantly splendid. Milton wrote few sonnets also, which are undoubtedly, undisputedly characterized by a lot of lucidity and clarity of style, because they are free from that great scholarliness, that much more classic elusiveness, which we find in his mature works. And the use of blank words instead of rhyme for Paradise Lost, which is an epical poem, was a bold innovation. And the sin of Adam and Eve was the dramatic center of Paradise Lost. In the same way, Samson Agonistes, 1671, a drama proper, the one classical tragedy in English that stands in conception and texture at the level as that of the Greeks. If we are discussing Milton, how can we forget the most important adjective to be used for Milton is Milton's grand style. मिल्टन को पढ़ें और मिल्टन के ग्रैंड स्टाइल को ना डिस्कस करें तो ये अधूरा रह जाएगा. मिल्टन or Milton's style in poetry has been designated in the universal campus of English literature as the grand style, and no other adjective, no other epithet could have aptly expressed the sublimity, the majesty, and the grandeur of his poetry. Everything about his poetry is grand, is majestic. There is not a square inch of his poetry from first to last where we can not confidently say that this is written by Milton and nobody else. In the first place, Milton's mind was nourished upon the best thoughts and the finest words and the finest diction of all ages. And why he was nourished upon the best thoughts and the best diction? Because he always loved to live in the companionship of the great and the wise people of the past time, who studied the great masters of all ages and imbibed from them in his art all the essential qualities of their greatness. He sought to be very great, very noble, very sublime, very sonorous, very dignified, and as Homer, Virgil, and Dante. And to become worthy of their great style, like Homer, Virgil, and Dante, he cultivated the qualities of a lofty character, like seriousness, sincerity, majesty, great willpower, etc. If you want to live with Milton, if you want to enjoy Milton, it is necessary to learn that art of poetry is no triviality, no mere amusement, but a high and grave thing. Milton, from the very start of his career, was devoid, was determined not to use those common words. And he was determined to avoid carelessness and formlessness in his writings. Each and every word has to be weighed before being put in the poetic composition. Words which were employed that had majesty, grandeur, sublimity, sonority. And all the words used by Milton were deliberately chosen for fulfilling three functions. And what are these three functions? Pehla, he wanted the exact expression of thought. Number two, the power of suggestion. And number three, the musical effect required, especially for the verse. Now we will discuss Paradise Lost, his epical work, and how it is a classical epic. You must have heard, you must have known, you must have studied the two great masters of the classical epic, that is Homer and Virgil. And as I have just told you, that Milton always sought to write an epic which could be placed near Homer, or you can say which could be placed near Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid. And he too, to a great extent, designed his Paradise Lost in accordance with Iliad and Aeneid. That is these two greatest epics of all times. And undoubtedly, he achieved a great success as an epic writer, and in spite of certain drawbacks or even limitations, he gets the rightful place among half a dozen classics in the entire world. As we have already discussed earlier, the theme of an epic must have a national significance. कोई वो छोटा मोटा नहीं हो सकता. That person has to have the significance up to the national level and must be a true and faithful mirror of life and thought of the nation. So, if we talk about Homer, Homer represents the national life of the Greeks, and Virgil expresses the hopes and aspirations of the people of the Rome. So both these great masters, they talk about their own nation, about their own people. But the theme of Paradise Lost goes beyond a particular race, a particular nation, particular nationality. And it is of universal character, that is the fall of man, which was unattempted either in prose or rhyme. And it was the genius of Milton only that he was in a position to give his particular subject a particular shape dealing with the entire human race. So if we compare even Virgil and Homer, taking into consideration his level of approach, then undoubtedly we can say that maybe he is not superior to both of them, but he is equal to them. And any epic must have three qualifications. First, it should be a single action, it should have an entire action, and it should have a great action. And the action of Paradise Lost is one. This means it has a unity of texture and unity of action. Its action is entire. इसका मतलब होता है कि it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the action in Paradise Lost is contrived in hell, executed upon earth, and punished by heaven. And in the third place, the action ought to be great. And by the greatness of action, Aristotle meant that it should not only be great in its nature, but also in the devotion part. So Paradise Lost does not determine the fate of one single person or nation, but of the entire human race. And the characters of the epic must have dignity, must have variety, because we have human as well as superhuman characters. Adam, Eve are humans, whereas God, Christ, Satan, the good and the bad angels are all superhuman characters. Adam is the hero of the epic, not because he's a warrior or a conqueror, but because he is a noble man. And epic is a serious poem with sublime and noble thoughts, and there is no room for light gaiety in the classical epic. An epic is also not without a moral, because moral forms an integral and intrinsic part of Milton's poetry. And the epic poets of the past followed the convention of beginning their work by invoking the muse. And the language of an epic must be sublime, and above all, the languages of the common man. And where Milton has employed all these methods to give an air of grandeur to his epic. His similes, his metaphors, all are epical. इसीलिए कहा जाता है Miltonic similes. Latinized words are introduced to make the poem look more grand, more beautiful. And Paradise Lost is a successful classical epic, and in the conception and the execution of its theme, the blind poet goes even beyond Homer and Virgil in certain respects.